The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Grand Hotel in Tropic, Utah Territory, and Lydia Preston knew immediately that something was wrong from the way Harold Gunderson stood on the wooden sidewalk with his arms crossed and his face set in stone. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Boston, enduring dust storms, rattling bones, and the constant fear of bandits, all because Harold had written such lovely letters about his ranch and his desire for a good Christian woman to share his life. He had not mentioned in any of those letters that he expected a pristine, untouched bride, but as Lydia stepped down from the coach in her best traveling dress, smoothing her auburn hair back into its pins, she could see rejection written all over his weathered face. "Mr. Gunderson?" she asked, even though she recognized him from the daguerreotype he had sent months ago. "Miss Preston," he said stiffly, his eyes traveling over her with cold assessment. "I received a telegram from the matrimonial agency yesterday. They informed me of certain facts you neglected to mention in your correspondence." Lydia felt her stomach drop. She had disclosed her widowhood in her initial application, but perhaps in her letters to Harold, she had focused more on her homemaking skills, her love of reading, and her dreams of building a life in the West. She had not dwelled on the year she had spent married to Thomas, or the fever that had taken him 3 winters past. "I did mention it in my application," she said quietly, aware that several townspeople had stopped to watch the scene unfold. "I am a widow, yes. My husband died of pneumonia in 1872. But I assure you, I am capable of being a good wife and helpmate." Harold's face reddened. "I specified in my requirements that I wanted an unmarried woman. A widow brings complications, previous attachments, comparisons. I am returning your travel expenses, but I cannot proceed with this arrangement." He thrust an envelope toward her, and Lydia took it with trembling fingers. The May sun beat down on her bonnet, and she could feel sweat beginning to trickle down her spine. The stagecoach driver had already tossed her trunk onto the sidewalk and was preparing to move the horses to the livery stable. "I see," Lydia said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Might you recommend a boarding house where I could stay while I make arrangements?" "The Grand Hotel accepts respectable women," Harold said, clearly eager to be done with this uncomfortable situation. "I wish you well, Miss Preston, or rather Mrs. Preston." He tipped his hat and walked away, his boots thudding on the wooden planks. Lydia stood there for a long moment, watching him go, feeling the weight of curious eyes upon her. She had left nothing behind in Boston except an empty apartment and memories. Her parents had passed years ago, her only sister had married and moved to Philadelphia, and after Thomas died, the city had felt like a tomb. The West had seemed like a fresh start, a place where her past would not matter so much. She had been very wrong about that. Blinking back tears, Lydia picked up her carpetbag and turned toward the hotel. Her trunk was too heavy to carry, so she would have to arrange for someone to bring it inside. The town of Tropic was smaller than she had imagined, a dusty collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley with towering red cliffs rising in the distance. The landscape was stark and beautiful in a way that made her heart ache. The hotel clerk, a thin man with spectacles, took her money without comment and handed her a key to a second-floor room. As Lydia climbed the stairs, she could hear the murmur of voices from the saloon next door and the tinkling of an out-of-tune piano. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. She sat on the bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. Then she washed her face, pinned up the strands of hair that had escaped during her journey, and went back downstairs to inquire about her trunk. The clerk directed her to a young man loitering outside who could be hired to carry heavy items. By the time her trunk was safely in her room, Lydia had spent $1 of her precious remaining funds. She counted the money Harold had returned, her travel expenses plus a bit extra, probably to assuage his guilt. It was enough to keep her in modest accommodations for perhaps 2 weeks if she was very careful. After that, she would need to find work. The thought was daunting but not terrifying. Lydia had worked as a seamstress before her marriage to Thomas, and she had continued taking and mending even after his death. Surely, a frontier town needed someone skilled with a needle. She changed out of her traveling dress into something simpler, a blue cotton day dress that she had made herself, and ventured out into the afternoon heat to explore Tropic. The town was laid out in a simple grid, with the main street running east to west. She counted a general store, a blacksmith, a livery stable, a doctor's office, a small church, 2 saloons, and a handful of other establishments. Beyond the main street, she could see residential houses, most of them modest wooden structures with small gardens. The red cliffs that surrounded the valley gave the whole place a feeling of isolation, as if Tropic existed in its own separate world. Lydia walked into the general store, a building that smelled of coffee, leather, and dried herbs. A middle-aged woman stood behind the counter, sorting through a box of canned goods. "Good afternoon," Lydia said. "I am new to town and wondering if you might know of anyone in need of seamstress services." The woman looked up, her expression cautious but not unfriendly. "You are the woman who came for Harold Gunderson. News traveled fast in small towns." Lydia nodded. "I am, but that arrangement did not work out. I am hoping to establish myself here independently." "I am Mrs. Sullivan," the woman said. "My husband owns this store. As for sewing, most women do their own mending, but there might be some call for more complicated work. Wedding dresses, baptismal gowns, that sort of thing. You might post a notice on the board outside the church." "Thank you," Lydia said. "I appreciate the suggestion, Mrs. Sullivan studied her for a moment. "It takes courage to come west alone, even more to stay when things do not go as planned. I hope you find what you are looking for here." The unexpected kindness made Lydia's throat tighten. She thanked Mrs. Sullivan again and left the store, feeling slightly more hopeful. She walked to the small white church at the end of the street and found the notice board Mrs. Sullivan had mentioned. Several papers were pinned there, advertising everything from lost livestock to land for sale. She had no paper or pencil with her, so she would have to return tomorrow. For now, she decided to walk a bit farther, following a path that led toward a creek she could hear burbling somewhere nearby. The sound of water was soothing after the dry, dusty journey, and she found herself drawn toward it. The creek ran clear and cold over smooth red rocks, lined with cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade. Lydia sat on a fallen log and watched the water flow, trying to calm the anxious flutter in her chest. She had been so certain that coming west was the right decision, that Harold's letters had revealed a good man who would appreciate a capable wife. The rejection stung not just because of the practical difficulties it created, but because it made her feel defective somehow, as if having loved and lost, Thomas made her damaged goods. She heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see a tall man leading a horse toward the water. He wore dusty work clothes, a faded blue shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. When he saw her, he paused. "Pardon me, madam," he said, his voice deep and courteous. "I did not mean to intrude. My horse needed water." "You are not intruding," Lydia said. "This creek does not belong to me." He led the horse forward, and the animal dipped its head to drink. The man removed his hat, revealing dark hair and a face that looked to be in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that were a striking gray blue. There was something about his expression, a sadness or weariness that seemed at odds with his strong build. "You must be the lady from Boston," he said. "The one Harold Gunderson was expecting." Lydia sighed. "Does everyone in Tropic know my business already?" A slight smile touched his lips. "Small town. Not much happens here, so when something does, people talk. I'm sorry it did not work out with Harold." "Are you a friend of his?" "Neighbor," the man said. "We are cordial, but I would not call us friends. He is a hard man, set in his ways. I am Asher Brooks, by the way. I have a ranch about 3 miles north of here." "Lydia Preston," she said, grateful that he used her married name without question. Asher Brooks studied her with those clear gray eyes. "Harold mentioned to some folks that he could not marry a widow. Said it would not be proper, with his standing in the community." Lydia felt a flare of anger. "And what exactly is improper about having been married before? I am not ashamed of having been a wife to a good man." "Nor should you be," Asher said quietly. He looked out at the creek for a moment, then back at her. "My wife died 4 years ago. Childbirth. The baby did not survive either. For a long time after, I felt like I had died too, like I was just going through the motions of living. People treated me differently once I was a widower. Some with pity, some with suspicion, as if grief might be contagious." The raw honesty in his words took Lydia by surprise. "I am so sorry for your loss." "And I am sorry for yours," Asher said. He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture that seemed almost nervous. "What I mean to say is, I understand a bit of what you might be feeling right now. It is not easy being the one left behind." "No," Lydia agreed softly. "It is not." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the creek and the horse drinking. There was something comfortable about Asher Brooks, despite having just met him. Perhaps it was the shared understanding of loss, or perhaps it was simply that he looked at her like a person rather than a problem to be solved. "What will you do now?" Asher asked. "Will you return to Boston?" "I cannot," Lydia admitted. "There is nothing for me there. I plan to stay in Tropic and establish myself as a seamstress. It may not be the life I imagined when I boarded that stagecoach, but I will make it work." Asher nodded slowly. "That takes grit. If you need any help getting settled, let me know. I come into town most Saturdays for supplies." "Thank you," Lydia said, touched by the offer. "I appreciate your kindness." He put his hat back on and touched the brim in a polite gesture. "Welcome to Tropic, Mrs. Preston. I hope it proves to be a good home for you." He led his horse away, and Lydia watched him go, feeling an odd warmth in her chest. For the first time since Harold Gunderson had rejected her on the street, she felt like perhaps things might be all right after all. Over the next few days, Lydia worked to establish herself in Tropic. She created a neat notice advertising her seamstress services and posted it at the church, the general store, and the hotel. She introduced herself to the other women in town, enduring their curious questions about Boston and her failed engagement with as much grace as she could muster. Mrs. Sullivan proved to be a valuable ally, introducing Lydia to several women who might need sewing work. Within a week, Lydia had taken on her first commission, altering a dress for a young woman preparing for her wedding. The work was exacting but satisfying, and when she delivered the finished product and saw the bride's delighted face, Lydia felt a sense of accomplishment that had been missing from her life for a long time. She also began attending Sunday services at the small church. The minister, Reverend Thompson, was a kindly older man who welcomed her warmly and made no mention of her widowhood or her rejected mail-order bride status. The congregation was small, perhaps 30 people in total, and most of them seemed genuinely friendly. It was at church on her second Sunday in Tropic that she saw Asher Brooks again. He sat in the back pew, his hat in his hands, listening to the sermon with a thoughtful expression. When the service ended and people began milling about outside, Lydia found herself gravitating toward him. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," she said. He turned and his face brightened. "Mrs. Preston, how are you settling in?" "Quite well, actually. I have already received several sewing commissions and people have been generally welcoming." "I am glad to hear it," Asher said. He hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you might like to see the ranch sometime. It is nothing fancy, but the land is beautiful, and I thought you might enjoy a ride out into the country. As a friend, of course. No expectations or obligations." Lydia considered the offer. In Boston, it would have been improper for a single woman to visit a single man's home without a chaperone. But this was the frontier, and the rules seemed more flexible here. More importantly, she found that she wanted to see Asher again, to talk with someone who understood what it was like to carry grief. "I would like that," she said. "Though I must confess I have not ridden a horse in several years." "We will take it slow," Asher promised. "How about next Saturday afternoon? I can bring a gentle mare into town for you." They made the arrangements, and Lydia spent the rest of the week looking forward to the outing with an anticipation that surprised her. She told herself it was simply because she was eager to see more of the beautiful country around Tropic, but in her quiet moments, she admitted that Asher himself was part of the appeal. Saturday arrived warm and clear. Asher appeared at the hotel at 2 o'clock with 2 horses, a large chestnut gelding for himself and a smaller dappled mare for Lydia. He helped her mount, his hands steady and respectful, and they set off northward out of town. The landscape was breathtaking. Red and white sandstone cliffs rose on all sides, striped with layers of ancient sediment. Juniper and pinyon pine dotted the hillsides, and wildflowers bloomed in unexpected patches of color. Asher pointed out landmarks as they rode, telling her about the history of the area and the challenges of ranching in such arid country. "Water is always the main concern," he explained. "I am fortunate to have a good spring on my property, but even so, there are dry years when it is a struggle to keep the cattle watered." "How many cattle do you have?" Lydia asked. "About 200 head right now. It is not a large operation, but it keeps me fed and provides a modest income. I also raise some horses, which is more profitable but also more work." They crested a rise, and Lydia caught her first view of Asher's ranch. It consisted of a sturdy log house, a barn, a corral, and several smaller outbuildings, all nestled in a valley with the spring-fed creek running through it. Mountains rose behind the property, their peaks still holding snow despite the lateness of the season. "It is beautiful," Lydia said honestly. Asher looked pleased. "My wife and I built the house together. She had a good eye for how things should be laid out. I have tried to maintain it the way she would have wanted." He led Lydia to the house and helped her dismount. Inside, the space was simple but well kept. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the furniture, though rough-hewn, was solid and functional. Lydia could see touches that suggested a woman's hand, a colorful quilt on the bed in the corner, gingham curtains at the windows, a shelf of books. "You keep it very neat," she observed. Asher shrugged. "I suppose I find comfort in order." After Sarah died, keeping the house maintained felt like a way of honoring her memory. Lydia understood that impulse. She had kept Thomas's watch long after his death, winding it every night even though there was no practical reason to do so. Eventually, she had given it to his younger brother, but for months that small ritual had helped her feel connected to him. Asher made coffee, and they sat at the rough wooden table, talking easily. He asked about Boston, and she described the crowded streets, the harbor, the way fog rolled in off the water on autumn mornings. She asked about his life, and he told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, coming to Utah Territory to find land of his own, meeting Sarah at a church social in a nearby town. She was from Illinois, Asher said, his voice soft with memory. Came west with her family when she was 16. She was not like other girls, always wanting to ride faster, explore further. She saw the ranch as an adventure, not a hardship. She sounds remarkable, Lydia said. She was. Asher stared into his coffee cup. For a long time after she died, I could not imagine ever wanting to share this place with someone else. It felt like a betrayal even to think about it. But lately, I have been wondering if maybe Sarah would not want me to spend the rest of my life alone. Lydia felt her heart beat a little faster. There was something significant in those words, a door being cautiously opened. I think anyone who loved you would want you to find happiness again. Asher looked up, meeting her eyes. The same would be true for you, would it not? Your husband would want you to build a new life. Yes, Lydia said. Thomas was not the sort of man who would have wanted me to mourn forever. He had a very practical nature. He would have told me to get on with living. Then perhaps we are both allowed to consider new possibilities, Asher said quietly. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Then Asher stood and cleared his throat. Let me show you the rest of the property. There is a spot by the upper pasture with a view that I think you will appreciate. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the ranch. Asher introduced her to his horses, including a young colt that was just learning to accept a halter. He showed her the garden plot where Sarah had grown vegetables, now somewhat overgrown but still producing volunteer tomatoes and squash. They walked to the upper pasture and stood looking out over the valley, the wind lifting Lydia's hair and making her skirts billow. I can see why you love it here, Lydia said. It feels like the world is bigger somehow, like there is room to breathe. That is exactly it, Asher agreed. In Texas, my family's ranch was surrounded by other ranches, other families. Here, I have space to think, to be myself without constantly being measured against everyone else's expectations. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the red rocks, Asher helped Lydia back onto her horse, and they rode slowly back toward Tropic. The evening air was cooling, pleasant after the heat of the day. Thank you for today, Lydia said as they reached the edge of town. It was wonderful to see the country and to learn more about your life here. Would you like to do it again? Asher asked. Perhaps next Saturday we could pack a picnic and ride out to some of the canyons. The scenery is even more dramatic there. I would like that very much, Lydia said. As she lay in her narrow hotel bed that night, Lydia found herself thinking about Asher's smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the gentleness with which he handled his horses. She was not ready to call what she felt love, not yet, but there was definitely something growing between them, something tender and promising. The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant pattern. Lydia's seamstress business grew steadily as word spread about the quality of her work. She took on increasingly complex projects, from men's suits to elaborate women's gowns. She moved out of the hotel and into a small room behind the general store that Mrs. Sullivan rented to her at a reasonable rate. The room was barely large enough for a bed and her sewing table, but it was hers, and she took pride in making it comfortable. Every Saturday, Asher came to town, and they spent the afternoon together. Sometimes they rode out to explore the canyons and mesas around Tropic. Other times they simply walked along the creek or sat in the shade of the cottonwoods, talking about everything and nothing. Lydia learned that Asher had a dry sense of humor and a deep love of books, particularly anything about history or exploration. He learned that she could sketch quite well and had a passion for wildflowers, often stopping to examine and identify different species. The townspeople noticed, of course. Mrs. Sullivan mentioned with approval that Asher Brooks was a good man who deserved happiness. Others were less tactful, asking Lydia directly if she expected to become Mrs. Brooks soon. "We are friends," Lydia would say, though increasingly that felt like an incomplete description of what was developing between them. One Saturday in July, Asher arrived with a wagon instead of horses. "I thought we might drive out to the ranch and I could make you dinner," he said. "I am no fancy cook, but I make a decent stew, and I have fresh bread from a neighbor who trades me baking for beef." Lydia agreed, and they drove through the afternoon heat to the ranch. While Asher tended to his animals and did a few necessary chores, Lydia sat on the porch of his house, sketching the view of the mountains. It felt surprisingly natural to be there, as if this place could become familiar, even home. When Asher called her inside, she found that he had set the table with actual china plates, not the tin ones she had seen on her first visit. There were even wildflowers in a jar in the center of the table. "This is lovely," she said, touched by the effort. Over dinner, their conversation took a more serious turn. Asher asked about her marriage to Thomas, and Lydia found herself able to talk about it honestly, without the sharp pain that had once accompanied such memories. "We were happy," she said. "Not in any grand, passionate way, but in a comfortable, steady way. We laughed together, we planned our future together. When he got sick, it happened so fast that I barely had time to prepare myself. One week he was coughing, the next he was gone. That is how it was with Sarah too," Asher said. "The labor started normally, or so the midwife said. But then something went wrong. There was so much blood. I have never felt so helpless in my life, standing there knowing I could do nothing to save her or the baby." Lydia reached across the table and took his hand. "I am sorry. I know those words do not help much, but I am." Asher turned his hand to clasp hers. "It does help, actually. Having someone who understands, who does not try to tell me it was God's will, or that time heals all wounds, or any of the other things people say when they do not know what else to offer." "Time does not heal," Lydia said. "It just teaches you how to carry the weight." "Yes," Asher agreed. "Exactly that." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped across the table. Then Asher took a breath and said, "Lydia, I need to be honest with you about something. I care for you. More than I expected to care for anyone again. When I am with you, I feel like maybe I could have a future that includes more than just work and solitude. But I also worry that I am being disloyal somehow to Sarah's memory, or that I am not ready, or that you might not feel the same way." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not sad tears. "I care for you too, Asher. I came to Tropic expecting to marry a man I had never met, to build a life with a stranger out of duty and practicality. Instead, I have found someone I genuinely enjoy being with, someone who makes me laugh and think and feel hopeful about tomorrow. That was not what I planned, but it might be something better." "I am not a romantic man," Asher warned. "I do not know if I can give you grand gestures or passionate declarations. What I can offer is steadiness, partnership, a home, and a promise to value you for exactly who you are." "That sounds perfect to me," Lydia said softly. Asher stood and came around the table. He drew Lydia to her feet, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then he cupped her face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing warmth. Lydia wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, feeling something inside her chest crack open and bloom like one of the desert flowers that waited years for rain. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Asher rested his forehead against hers. "Will you marry me, Lydia? Not because of any arrangement or obligation, but because I want to spend my life with you." "Yes," Lydia whispered. Yes, I will marry you. They decided on a short engagement, neither of them seeing the point in waiting. Asher was 32, Lydia was 28, and they were both old enough to know their own minds. They announced their plans to the town, and if some people thought it was too soon or inappropriate for two widowed people to find love again, they had the grace not to say so to their faces. Mrs. Sullivan was delighted and immediately began planning a celebration. It will not be fancy, she warned, but everyone will want to mark the occasion. Lydia sewed her own wedding dress, a simple but elegant design in cream-colored silk that she had splurged on from a catalog. She made Asher a new shirt as well, dark blue to match his eyes. They were married on a Saturday afternoon in late August, with Reverend Thompson officiating and what seemed like the entire population of Tropic in attendance. As Lydia stood beside Asher and spoke her vows, she thought about how strange life was, how unpredictable. 6 months ago, she had been in Boston, alone and uncertain. 3 months ago, she had stood in this very town feeling rejected and lost. Now she was marrying a good man, not out of desperation or duty but out of genuine affection and hope for the future. When Asher kissed her as his wife, the crowd cheered. Mrs. Sullivan had organized a party in the church hall, with food contributed by various families and music provided by a fiddler who lived on a nearby homestead. Lydia danced with her new husband, both of them laughing when they fumbled the steps, and felt a happiness she had not experienced in years. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Asher helped Lydia into the wagon for the drive back to the ranch. She had already moved most of her belongings there over the past week, transforming the bachelor household into a proper home. She had sewn new curtains, made a fresh quilt, and filled the shelves with her books alongside Asher's. "Are you happy?" Asher asked as they drove through the gathering darkness, the stars beginning to appear overhead. "Yes," Lydia said simply. "I am." Life on the ranch was not easy, but it was good. Lydia learned how to manage a household in the wilderness, how to preserve food, how to make soap and candles, how to coax vegetables from the difficult soil. She continued her sewing work, taking commissions from women in Tropic and surrounding areas, her skills becoming well known throughout the region. Asher proved to be a considerate husband, always mindful of her comfort and happiness. They worked together on the ranch, Lydia helping with lighter tasks like feeding chickens and tending the garden while Asher handled the heavier work with the cattle and horses. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, reading aloud to each other or simply talking about their days. Their physical relationship developed slowly, both of them navigating the strangeness of sharing intimacy with someone new after having been married before. But there was tenderness between them, and humor too, which made the awkward moments less awkward and the good moments even better. By winter, Lydia knew that she loved Asher deeply, in a way that was different from how she had loved Thomas but no less real. Thomas had been her first love, the safe harbor of her youth. Asher was her chosen love, the person she had found after knowing loss and choosing to risk her heart again. "I never thought I would feel this way again," she told him one snowy evening as they lay in bed, the wind howling outside but the house warm and secure. "Nor did I," Asher admitted, "but I am grateful we both had the courage to try." In the spring, Lydia discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a complicated mix of emotions. She was thrilled but also terrified, knowing what had happened to Sarah. Asher was excited but equally afraid, his joy tempered by the memory of loss. "We will get through this together," Lydia assured him. "I am strong, and we will make sure I have the best care available." Asher arranged for a doctor from a larger town to come stay at the ranch as Lydia's due date approached. He also hired a midwife with decades of experience. Throughout the pregnancy, he was attentive and protective without being overbearing, always checking to make sure Lydia was comfortable and that she was not overworking herself. Lydia continued sewing almost until the end, finding the work soothing for her nerves. She made tiny gowns and blankets for the baby, embroidering them with careful stitches. She wrote letters to her sister in Philadelphia, telling her about her new life and her impending motherhood. The baby came on a warm day in October, after a labor that was long but not dangerous. When the midwife placed the squalling infant in Lydia's arms, she wept with relief and joy. It was a boy, healthy and strong, with a thick cap of dark hair and his father's blue-gray eyes. "What should we name him?" Asher asked, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed at his son. "What about Samuel?" Lydia suggested. "It was my father's name." "Samuel Brooks," Asher said, testing it out. "I like it. Welcome to the world, Samuel." The months after Samuel's birth were exhausting but wonderful. Lydia discovered that motherhood came naturally to her, though there were certainly moments of doubt and frustration. Asher was a devoted father, often getting up in the night to bring the baby to Lydia for feeding, then walking Samuel around the house to soothe him back to sleep. Mrs. Sullivan and other women from town came to visit, bringing food and baby clothes and much-needed adult conversation. Lydia had worried about being isolated on the ranch, but she found that the community of Tropic was more supportive than she had imagined possible. As Samuel grew from an infant into a toddler, Lydia watched Asher blossom as a father. He was patient and playful, teaching Samuel about the animals, letting him help with ranch chores, reading to him every evening before bed. Sometimes Lydia would catch Asher looking at their son with an expression of such profound gratitude that it made her chest ache. "I never dared to hope for this," he told her one night. "After losing Sarah and the baby, I thought that door had closed forever. But you gave me back something I thought was gone. You gave me the same thing," Lydia said. "A home, a family, a reason to believe in new beginnings." When Samuel was 3, Lydia became pregnant again. This time the fear was less acute, though still present. She had come through one pregnancy safely, which gave her confidence. This labor was faster, and their daughter arrived just after dawn on a spring morning, her cries loud and indignant. "She has your determination already," Asher said with a laugh as the baby wailed. They named her Clara after Asher's mother. She was a different baby than Samuel had been, more demanding and vocal, but equally beloved. Samuel was fascinated by his little sister, always wanting to help care for her. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and growth. The ranch prospered as Asher's reputation for quality horses spread. Lydia's sewing business remained steady, and she began teaching some of the younger women in Tropic her more advanced techniques. Samuel started attending the small school that had been established in town, riding in with Asher on days when ranch work did not require him to be home. The years were not without challenges. There was a drought one summer that reduced their water supply to a trickle and forced Asher to sell off some of the cattle. Clara came down with scarlet fever when she was 5, and Lydia spent a terrifying week nursing her through it. Asher broke his leg when a horse threw him, and for 6 weeks he was forced to rely on Lydia and hired help to keep the ranch running. But through all of it, they faced each difficulty as a team, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating the good ones. They added a room onto the house as the children grew. They planted an orchard, apple and peach trees that would take years to bear fruit, but represented their faith in the future. They built a life together that honored their pasts while embracing their present. One evening, when Samuel was 10 and Clara was 7, The family sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the red cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. Samuel was reading a book. Clara was playing with a doll Lydia had made for her, and Asher sat with his arm around his wife, content. "Do you ever regret it?" Asher asked quietly. "Coming west, the way everything happened." Lydia thought about the question seriously. She thought about the long journey from Boston, about standing in the street while Harold Gunderson rejected her, about the fear and uncertainty of those first days in Tropic. Then she thought about everything that had come after. Meeting Asher by the creek, their slow courtship, the wedding, the birth of their children, the thousand small moments of joy and partnership that had woven together to create this life. "No," she said firmly. "I do not regret any of it. Even the hard parts led me here to this porch, to this family. If I could go back and change things, make it easier somehow, I would not, because I might have missed this." Asher pulled her closer and kissed the top of her head. "I feel the same way. I wish Sarah and Thomas had not died, that they could have had long, happy lives. But since they could not, I am grateful that you and I found each other, that we both had the courage to love again." Samuel looked up from his book. "Papa, what was it like when you met Mama?" Asher and Lydia exchanged a smile. They had told their children the story before, but they never tired of hearing it. "Well," Asher began, "your mother came to Tropic expecting to marry someone else, but that man was foolish enough to reject her because she had been married before. He thought being a widow made her somehow less worthy." "That is silly," Clara said indignantly. "Very silly," Lydia agreed. "But I was sitting by the creek feeling rather sorry for myself when your father came along with his horse. He was kind to me, and he told me something that made me feel less alone." "What did he say?" Samuel asked, even though he knew the answer. "He said, 'That makes two of us,'" Asher replied. "Because I was a widower, and I understood what it felt like to have lost someone and to have people treat you differently because of it. Your mother and I started as friends, two people who understood each other's grief. But slowly, we became more than friends." "You fell in love," Clara said with the romantic certainty of a 7-year-old. "We did," Lydia confirmed. "Not the same way I loved your papa's first wife or the way he loved my first husband, but in a new way built on friendship and respect and choosing each other every day." As darkness fell and the stars emerged, the family went inside. Asher lit the lamps while Lydia prepared the children for bed. Samuel and Clara shared a room, their beds separated by a curtain Lydia had sewn. She tucked them in, listening to their prayers, then joined Asher in the main room. They sat together by the fire, Asher working on mending a piece of tack and Lydia embroidering a tablecloth she planned to give Mrs. Sullivan for Christmas. The quiet domestic scene was punctuated by the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of one of the children shifting in sleep. "Do you think they understand how lucky we are?" Lydia asked softly. "Maybe not now," Asher said, "but someday they will. We will make sure they know that love is not something that runs out, that having loved before does not diminish your capacity to love again. That grief and joy can exist side by side." Lydia nodded, thinking about how much she had grown since that day she stepped off the stagecoach in Tropic. She had come west as a woman seeking security and a fresh start. She had found so much more. A true partner, a family, a community, and most importantly, herself. The frightened widow who had been rejected by Harold Gunderson felt like a different person now, someone from a past life. Over the years that followed, the Brooks family continued to thrive. Samuel grew into a serious young man with his father's steady nature and his mother's creativity. He showed an aptitude for working with horses that made Asher proud. Clara was more outgoing, always organizing games with the other children in town and coming home with stories and schemes. When she was 12, she announced that she wanted to be a teacher, and Lydia and Asher did everything they could to encourage that ambition. Lydia's sewing business evolved as her children needed less constant attention. She began designing and selling patterns, her work becoming known throughout Utah Territory. She took on an apprentice, a young woman from town who showed real talent with a needle. Asher expanded the ranch, buying adjacent property when it became available, building the operation into something substantial that could support the family, and eventually be passed down to Samuel if he chose that path. They made friends with other ranching families in the area, creating a network of mutual support. There were barn dances and church socials, holiday gatherings and summer picnics. Lydia maintained correspondence with her sister in Philadelphia, the letters growing more infrequent over the years, but never stopping entirely. She sent photographs of the children, and her sister sent news of city life that seemed increasingly foreign to Lydia's ears. When Samuel was 17, he met a girl named Margaret at a church social, and Lydia watched him fall in love with the same certainty and intensity that characterized everything he did. Margaret was a sweet girl from a neighboring ranch, practical and hardworking. Lydia liked her immediately and was not surprised when Samuel came home one evening and announced his intention to marry once he turned 18. "You are sure?" Asher asked his son. "You are young still." "I am the same age you were when you married Sarah," Samuel pointed out. "And you have always told me that when you know, you know." Asher glanced at Lydia, and she saw the mix of pride and melancholy in his eyes. Their son was becoming a man, making his own choices, starting his own life. "Then you have our blessing," Lydia said. "Margaret is a fine young woman, and I think you will be happy together." Samuel and Margaret were married the following summer in a ceremony that reminded Lydia of her own wedding to Asher, simple and heartfelt and full of community. Asher gave the young couple a section of the ranch to build their own home, and Samuel threw himself into the work of establishing his household with Margaret. Clara, meanwhile, pursued her dream of teaching. She attended a normal school in Salt Lake City, coming home during summers and holidays with stories of her classes and the other students. She was bright and passionate about education, determined to make a difference in children's lives. As Lydia entered her 50s, she found herself reflecting more often on the journey that had brought her to this place. The pain of losing Thomas had long since faded to a bittersweet ache, a memory she could hold without being consumed by it. She thought he would have been happy for her, for the life she had built in the West. Asher, in his mid-50s, had gray in his hair now and lines around his eyes, but he was still strong and vital. He moved a bit slower than he once had, but his mind was sharp and his dedication to the ranch unwavering. They had talked about eventually turning more of the operation over to Samuel, but for now, Asher was not ready to stop working. One warm summer evening, Lydia and Asher rode out to a favorite spot on the ranch, a high meadow with a view that stretched for miles. They had not done this in years, too busy with the demands of the ranch and family, but Clara was visiting from her teaching position in a nearby town, and Samuel and Margaret were managing things capably. They dismounted and stood looking out at the landscape painted gold by the setting sun. Asher put his arm around Lydia's waist, and she leaned into him, comfortable with the familiar warmth of his body beside hers. "You remember the first time I brought you out here?" Asher asked. "Of course," Lydia said. "It was one of our early outings before we were courting officially. I sketched the view and you told me about your dreams for the ranch. I was already falling in love with you then," Asher admitted, "but I was afraid to say it, afraid I was betraying Sarah or moving too fast." "I was falling in love with you too," Lydia said, "though I did not want to admit it, even to myself." I had come to Tropic expecting one kind of marriage, and what we were building was so much better than that. It frightened me how much I wanted it. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun slip behind the distant mountains. Then Asher said, "I was thinking about Harold Gunderson today, wondering whatever happened to him." Lydia laughed. "Why on earth were you thinking about him?" "Because I realized that if he had not been such a fool, if he had married you like he was supposed to, I would never have met you. Never had this life, these children. So in a strange way, I suppose I owe him thanks." "That is a generous perspective," Lydia said, amused. "Though I suspect if you told him that, he would not appreciate the irony." "Probably not," Asher agreed. "Last I heard, he was still unmarried, still running his ranch alone and complaining about how difficult it is to find good help." Lydia felt a pang of pity for Harold, but it was distant and impersonal. Whatever bitterness she had felt about his rejection had long since dissolved. That rejection had been a gift, though she had not recognized it at the time. "We should head back," Asher said as the light began to fade. "But I wanted to tell you something first. I know I am not good with fancy words or grand romantic gestures. But Lydia, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Marrying you, building this life together, it has been the greatest privilege of my existence. I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." Tears sprang to Lydia's eyes. After all these years, Asher could still surprise her, still touch her heart in unexpected ways. "I love you too," she whispered. "So very much." They kissed as the stars began to appear overhead, and Lydia felt the same flutter in her chest that she had experienced on their first kiss in this very spot so many years ago. Love, she had learned, was not a finite resource that got used up. It was something that grew and deepened, that could encompass joy and sorrow, passion and comfort, past and present. They rode back to the ranch in the gathering darkness, the horses knowing the way home even when the path was hard to see. Lights glowed in the windows of the house, and Lydia could see Clara's silhouette moving about inside, probably helping to prepare supper. Samuel and Margaret's house showed lights as well, a small constellation of home and family spreading across the land. As they approached, Clara came out onto the porch. "There you are. I was beginning to worry. Supper is ready whenever you are." "We are ready," Lydia called back. "We were just taking a ride down memory lane." Inside, the house smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread. Clara had set the table and made a berry pie from the wild berries that grew near the creek. Samuel and Margaret arrived shortly after Asher and Lydia, and they all sat down to eat together, the conversation flowing easily as they shared stories and laughter. Looking around the table at her family, Lydia felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been seeking when she left Boston, though she had not known it then. Not just a husband or a home, but belonging, purpose. A place where her past was acknowledged but did not define her, where she was valued for who she was, not what she had been or what she had lost. After supper, they moved to the porch to enjoy the cool evening air. Samuel told them about his plans to expand his herd, seeking his father's advice. Clara talked about her students and the challenges of teaching in a one-room schoolhouse. Margaret mentioned that she thought she might be pregnant, news that was met with excited congratulations. As the evening wore on and the younger people drifted home or to bed, Lydia and Asher remained on the porch, rocking slowly in the chairs they had built together years ago. "Grandmother and grandfather," Asher said wonderingly. "We are getting old, Lydia. Speak for yourself," Lydia teased. "I feel quite spry." Asher laughed and reached over to take her hand. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, watching the night sky and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Over the next few years, their family continued to grow. Margaret and Samuel had 3 children in quick succession, 2 boys and a girl. Clara met a young lawyer named Daniel while teaching in town, and after a courtship conducted largely through letters since he lived in Salt Lake City, they married and settled there. Clara continued teaching while Daniel built his practice, and they visited the ranch several times a year. Lydia and Asher gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operation of the ranch, turning more responsibility over to Samuel. They were not idle, still helping where they could and maintaining their own household, but the pace of their lives slowed to something more sustainable for people in their 60s. Lydia spent more time on her sewing, creating intricate quilts and embroidered pieces that were more art than practical goods. She taught her granddaughters to sew, passing down skills and patterns that had been in her family for generations. Asher took up woodworking, making furniture and toys for the grandchildren with the same careful attention he had always brought to ranch work. They traveled occasionally, visiting Clara in Salt Lake City, and taking a memorable trip to Philadelphia to see Lydia's sister, who was now elderly but still sharp as a tack. Seeing the crowded eastern cities again made Lydia appreciate the wide open spaces of Utah even more. She was glad she had made the journey west, glad she had taken the risk of leaving everything familiar behind. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Asher surprised Lydia with a gift. It was a leather-bound journal, beautifully crafted, with her initials embossed on the cover. "I thought you might want to write down some of your memories," he explained. "For the grandchildren, so they will know the story of how we came together, what life was like when we were young." Lydia was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. She began writing that very evening, starting with her decision to answer the advertisement for a mail-order bride, the journey west, the rejection by Harold Gunderson, and the fateful meeting with Asher by the creek. The writing came easily, memories she had not thought about in years rising to the surface with clarity and detail. She wrote about their courtship, their wedding, the births of their children. She wrote about the challenges they had faced, the droughts and illnesses and injuries, and how they had faced them together. She wrote about the joy of watching their children grow, the satisfaction of building something lasting, the quiet contentment of a life well lived. As she wrote, Lydia realized that her story was not just about her and Asher, but about resilience and second chances, about the courage it takes to remain open to love after loss. She hoped her grandchildren would read it someday and understand that life rarely goes according to plan, but that sometimes the detours lead to places more wonderful than the original destination. Years passed in the comfortable rhythm of seasons and celebrations. Grandchildren grew and more were born. The ranch prospered under Samuel's management, and he proved to have an even better head for business than his father, finding new markets for their horses and beef. Clara became the principal of her school, respected throughout the community for her dedication and skill. Lydia and Asher aged gracefully together, their bodies slowing but their minds remaining sharp. They celebrated their 25th anniversary, then their 30th. Each milestone felt like a gift, especially given that they had both lost their first spouses young. They did not take a single day together for granted. When Lydia was 68, she fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Asher was frantic with worry, remembering how Thomas had died of the same illness. But Lydia was strong, and with the help of a skilled doctor and Asher's devoted nursing, she pulled through. The illness left her weaker than before, but she recovered enough to resume most of her normal activities. "You scared me half to death," Asher told her once she was out of danger. "I am not leaving you yet," Lydia assured him. "We still have too much living to do." And they did. They saw Samuel and Margaret's youngest son graduate from the university in Salt Lake City. They attended the wedding of their first grandchild, a joyous occasion that brought together family from across the territory. They celebrated their 35th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch house packed to bursting with love and laughter. One spring evening, when Lydia was 72 and Asher was 76, they took a slow walk down to the creek where they had first met so many years ago. The cottonwood trees had grown taller, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, but the essential character of the place remained unchanged. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had stayed in Boston?" Asher asked. Lydia considered the question. "Sometimes. I imagine I would have continued working as a seamstress, living alone in my small apartment, growing old without family or purpose. It would have been a small, quiet life. Do you wish you had that instead? Something easier, less demanding?" "Not for a moment," Lydia said firmly. "This life has asked much of me, but it has given me so much more in return, a partner who respects and cherishes me. Children and grandchildren I adore, work that matters, a community I belong to. I would not trade any of it for an easier path." Asher kissed her forehead tenderly. "You have given me more than I ever hoped for after Sarah died. I thought I was done with happiness, that I would spend the rest of my days merely existing. But you showed me that there was still joy to be found, still love to be lived." "We showed each other," Lydia corrected. "It was not just you or just me, but both of us together, willing to take a chance on something new." They stood by the creek for a long time, two people who had found each other in the midst of loss and built something beautiful together. The sun set behind the red cliffs, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The water burbled over the smooth stones, the same eternal song it had been singing on the day they met. Eventually, they walked slowly back to the ranch house, their steps measured but steady. Inside, a lamp glowed in the window, a beacon of home. They had built this life together, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. And as Lydia looked at Asher's profile in the fading light, his face lined with age but still so dear to her, she felt grateful for every moment they had shared and every moment yet to come. That night, lying in bed with Asher's arm around her, Lydia thought about the young widow who had stepped off the stagecoach in Tropic all those years ago, frightened and alone and rejected. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything was going to be all right, that the rejection was not an ending but a beginning, that the best years of her life were still ahead of her. But perhaps that woman had known on some deep instinctive level that taking a chance on the West was the right choice. Perhaps her courage in staying even after Harold's rejection had been the first step toward this life, this love, this contentment. "Thank you," Lydia whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Asher asked sleepily. "For seeing me," she said. "For understanding. For choosing me when I needed to be chosen." "Thank you for choosing me back," Asher replied. "For taking a chance on a lonely widower with a broken heart." "It was not broken," Lydia said. "Just waiting to be filled again." As they drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for more than 3 decades, Lydia felt at peace. Her life had not been what she expected when she was young. She had known love and loss, rejection and acceptance, struggle and triumph. But through it all, she had found her way to this moment, this man, this home, and that made everything, every hardship and heartache worthwhile. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Spring brought new calves and foals. Summer brought long, hot days of work. Autumn brought harvest and preparation. Winter brought snow and rest. Lydia and Asher moved through these rhythms more slowly now, but they still moved together, still partners in all things. They celebrated their 40th anniversary with a party that brought people from all over the territory. Former neighbors, old friends, family members of all ages gathered to honor the couple who had become something of a legend in the area. The mail-order bride and the widowed rancher who had found love against all odds. Samuel gave a speech, talking about what he had learned from watching his parents build their marriage on mutual respect and steadfast commitment. Clara read from the journal Lydia had written, passages that made people laugh and cry. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren performed songs and recitations. When it was Asher's turn to speak, he stood slowly, holding Lydia's hand for support. "I am not much for speeches," he began, "but I want to say this. 40 years ago, I met a woman by the creek who had just been rejected by a foolish man who could not see her worth. That rejection was the greatest blessing of my life, because it meant she was free for me to love. Lydia, you have been my partner, my best friend, my comfort, and my joy. Every day with you has been a gift. Here is to 40 more years." People laughed at that, given their ages, but they raised their glasses in toast. Lydia stood and kissed her husband, not caring who was watching, grateful beyond words for the life they had shared. As the party wound down and family members departed or settled in guest rooms in the barn loft, Lydia and Asher sat on their porch one more time, looking out at the land they loved. 40 years, Lydia marveled. "It has gone so fast." "And so slow," Asher countered. "I remember so many moments with such clarity. Your face when Samuel was born, the way you looked in your wedding dress, that first kiss by the creek." "I remember all of it too," Lydia said. "Every moment has been precious." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their love story and had watched it unfold year by year. The ranch was quiet now, the party over, but the evidence of their life together was everywhere. In the solid house they had maintained and improved, in the barns and corrals, in the trees they had planted, in the children and grandchildren sleeping under their roof. This was their legacy, not just property and possessions, but love multiplied across generations, wisdom passed down, values instilled. They had started with nothing but their mutual grief and willingness to try again, and they had built an empire of the heart. As Lydia and Asher entered their late 70s, they finally fully retired from ranch work, content to let Samuel and his sons manage everything. They spent their days reading, working on small projects, and most importantly, enjoying time with their ever-growing family. There were now so many grandchildren and great-grandchildren that Lydia had started keeping a chart to remember all their birthdays. Their health declined gradually, but not catastrophically. Asher's joints ached in the winter, and he walked with a cane. Lydia's eyesight faded enough that she had to give up her intricate sewing work, though she could still handle simpler projects. But they were together, and that made every limitation bearable. On a warm June morning, shortly after their 43rd anniversary, Asher woke before dawn as he always had. He looked over at Lydia sleeping peacefully beside him, her white hair spread across the pillow, her face relaxed in sleep. He thought about how beautiful she still was to him, how much he loved her, how grateful he was for every day they had shared. He got up quietly, not wanting to wake her, and went outside to watch the sunrise. The sky lightened slowly, painting the red cliffs in shades of gold and rose. Birds sang their morning songs and the ranch came to life around him. This was his favorite time of day, always had been, when the world felt new and full of possibility. Samuel found him there an hour later, sitting peacefully in his chair on the porch, his eyes closed, a slight smile on his face. He had passed quietly, looking out at the land he loved, at peace with a life well lived, Lydia was devastated when Samuel gently woke her with the news. Even though she had known this day would come, had prepared herself for it as much as anyone could, the reality of Asher's absence was crushing. They had been together for more than 4 decades, and she did not know how to exist without him. The funeral was large, attended by people from all over Utah Territory. Asher had been respected and loved by many, known as a fair man, a skilled rancher, a devoted husband and father. They buried him in a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that read, Asher Brooks, beloved husband, father, and friend. In the weeks after Asher's death, Lydia moved through her days in a haze of grief. She stayed in the ranch house with Samuel's family, unable to bear being alone. She thought constantly of Asher, remembered their conversations, their quiet moments, the way he had looked at her even after decades of marriage. But gradually, as spring turned to summer and summer to autumn, Lydia began to find her footing again. She remembered what she had learned when Thomas died, that grief was not something you got over, but something you learned to carry. She thought about what Asher would want for her, and she knew it was not to give up, to stop living just because he was gone. So she returned to her routines, simpler now but still purposeful. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, making sure they understood what a good man he had been. She finished the quilt she had been working on, each stitch a meditation, a prayer, a connection to all the quilts she had made over the years. She reread the journal she had written, adding new entries about Asher's final years, their last anniversary, the peaceful way he had left this world. She wanted the family to know the whole story, beginning to end, so they would understand that love was worth the risk, worth the eventual pain of loss. Clara visited often, worried about her mother living alone in her grief. But Lydia reassured her that she was all right, that she carried Asher with her always in her heart and memories. He gave me 43 years I might never have had, Lydia told her daughter. I will not dishonor that gift by refusing to live the rest of my life as fully as I can. Lydia lived for 3 more years after Asher's passing, years that were quieter but not unhappy. She saw more great-grandchildren born, attended more weddings, celebrated more milestones. She moved from the ranch house to a small cottage in Tropic, closer to Clara, who had returned to the area after her husband's retirement. On a cool October evening at the age of 80, Lydia passed away peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face, Asher's watch clutched in her hand. They buried her next to her husband on the hill overlooking the ranch, with a stone that read, Lydia Preston Brooks, beloved wife, mother, and friend. The ranch continued under Samuel's care, then his sons, carrying on the legacy that Asher and Lydia had built together. The house they had shared was maintained carefully, becoming something of a family museum, filled with photographs and mementos, and the quilt Lydia had made from scraps of fabric representing different moments in their life together. The journal Lydia had written was passed down through generations, read by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who wanted to understand where they came from. The story of the mail-order bride who was rejected for being a widow and the cowboy who said, "That makes 2 of us," became family legend, told and retold, a reminder that love could be found in unexpected places, that second chances were real, that courage and hope could transform a life. Years later, a great-great-granddaughter stood by the creek where Asher and Lydia had first met, reading from the journal for a school project. She read about the fear and loneliness, the gradual building of trust, the deep abiding love that had sustained them through decades of life together. They were so brave, the girl said to her mother, Samuel's granddaughter, to try again after losing people they loved. They were, her mother agreed. And they showed all of us that being brave enough to love, even after loss, is what makes life worth living. The creek burbled over the stones, unchanged by the passage of time, a constant witness to the story that had begun there so many years ago. The cottonwood trees rustled in the breeze, and the red cliffs glowed in the afternoon sun. The land remembered, even if individuals forgot, and the love that had been planted there continued to bear fruit generation after generation. In the end, Lydia and Asher's story was not about the rejection that brought them together, but about everything that came after. The choice to be vulnerable again, to build something new from the ruins of loss, to honor the past while embracing the future. They had shown that widowhood was not an ending but could be a beginning, that hearts could heal and expand to hold new love without diminishing what came before. Their legacy lived on not just in the ranch or the family, but in the example they had set, the proof they had provided that it was never too late to start over, to take a chance, to believe in happiness again. They had been two broken people who found each other at exactly the right moment, and together they had become whole. And that was the greatest love story of all.